Okay, welcome back. So we are back with the stratification unit. We've just talked about Davis and Moore was my last video, and if you're arriving fresh, then great. You're obviously targeting the things that you are struggling with. Now, I will say, Karl Marx is one of the ones that a lot of people struggle with. So I'm predicting this video probably is one of the more popular ones. So yeah, let's get on with it. And an interesting sheet because there's not all that much for you to do in terms of things you might have to fill out on your yellow sheet. There is a question here which we won't go through. Hopefully, your teacher has gone through that with you. But let's go through the sheet itself. There's some sort of difficult language and some difficult ideas, but hopefully, fingers crossed, I can sort of enlighten you a little bit as to what it all sort of means. So, Karl Marx, hopefully you know by now, but Karl Marx is a Marxist, stands to reason. So if you ever get a 4 marker, not that I can really see that happening, but if you got a 4 marker or a 3 marker about just Marx, then tell them that he's a Marxist. So he saw social stratification, get my words out, as a system which allowed a privileged few to exploit the many. Now, hopefully you already know these keywords, but the privileged few he's talking about is the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, and the many that he talks about are the proletariat, or the working class. Now, Marx believed that systems of stratification arose from the relationships of social groups to the means of production. And what they mean by means of production is the land, the capital, so the money, um, labor power, so sort of manpower, buildings, and machinery. Now, it's worth remembering before we actually sort of start with all this is that Marx was writing around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so when he talks about machinery, buildings, labor power, he's talking about sort of big factories in sort of big sort of dusty cities. If anyone's seen Peaky Blinders or anything like that, that's what he's talking about. Okay, that sort of period of time. So social systems of stratification arose from the relationships of social groups to the means of production. Now, what he means by social groups, I mean, it is people fundamentally, but he's actually talking about the bourgeoisie and proletariat. So the social groups are those two groups, and only one of them owns or at least has the means of production, and that group is the bourgeoisie. They own the land, they own the capital, they employ labor power, they own the buildings, and they own the machinery. Okay, so Marx is arguing that stratification, the way that we organize society, is basically based around who owns what. Okay, and the truth of the matter is the bourgeoisie, the privileged few, own all of it. Okay, they own pretty much everything. Okay, his theory of history described Western society as developing through 4 main historical periods. So he talks a little bit about how we got to this situation where the few, the bourgeoisie, own pretty much everything and continue to exploit the many, the proletariat. So he argues that we started in a form of primitive communism. This idea that everyone worked together to ensure they had shelter and enough to eat. So, sort of hunter-gatherer sort of situation. Everyone shares, they contribute. And that's why he talks about it as primitive communism. Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know, communism is the opposite of capitalism. And it's the idea that we should all be sort of sharing, everything. Everyone should share everything. And way back when in history, we used to work like that. So some people would go and hunt, some people would gather, some people would build, but the whole point is that we did that without being paid, but everyone shared everything. So you would never sort of want for anything. But then we moved on to a slightly different period of history. We moved on to ancient society. So we became more advanced. Okay, so technology was still, by today's standards, very poor, but we developed tools. We sort of developed a more advanced society. And it also says this word, slaves. Okay, so we went from having a communist system where everyone shared everything to a system where, unfortunately, some people actually got, well, very much exploited as slaves. Now, hopefully, we all know what that means. But that's where we were for a little bit. And then we moved on to what he called feudal society. So this is where we get to sort of like maybe the Middle Ages and sort of talking about kings and nobles and sort of how they used to sort of own their land. And they would employ people that they called serfs. Okay. And that's basically the serfs were the majority of people, the peasants and things like that, to work on their land and produce food and goods to be sold. And the profit would go to the kings and the nobles. Okay. So not too far actually from where we are right now. Okay, but it wasn't a very even relationship. Okay, the kings and the nobles, they weren't elected. Okay, they didn't have votes, the peasants, to sort of see who would be the king. Okay, the kings and the nobles were just there by inherited right. Now, then we move on to capitalism. Now, this is where we are now. Okay, we are in the latter stages of capitalism. Capitalism has been going on for quite a long time now. But the idea of capitalism is that basically you sell your labor for money, for profit, and then you use that money or profit to buy goods and services, and that's how the world works. That's basically it. Okay, so let's move on slightly. So Marx believed that as agriculture developed, it produced surplus wealth and the accumulation of private property, the precondition for an emergence of a class of non-producers who gain control of the means of production, thereby making it that others had to work for them. Now, that's a long sentence. I didn't realize quite how long that sentence was. So he's actually still talking about this progression from primitive communism all the way through to capitalism. Now, he basically talked about how basically people would be farming and sort of producing goods, but eventually they stopped just sort of breaking even in terms of sort of just making enough money to survive. They actually made a lot more than they needed. And so they actually those people who made more than they needed started buying up land and producing more and more and more and more. And it was like a progression to the point where actually they didn't need to produce anymore. They could just sit back and employ people to do it for them. They didn't have to work the farm. We could just employ someone else to do it. Okay, so they had control of the means of production. They had the land, the machinery to produce the stuff that made profit, but they no longer actually had to operate it themselves. They could employ people, a subject class, to do it for them. Now, he talks about this keyword. So these workers often felt alienation. Now, alienation, for anyone who sort of knows the word itself, is the process of feeling disconnected. Okay, so if you feel alienated from your friend group, you might feel that you've been isolated away from your friend group a little bit. It's not a nice feeling. Now, what Marx is talking about is you feel alienated, you feel disconnected from society. So if you are just operating the same machine every day, doing the same thing over and over again, you start to think, well, what's the point? What's the point of this? Okay, and you don't ever sort of change anything, but it's that misery that comes with that feeling that Marx is talking about. He just moving on. So he believed that a specialized division of labor occurred. Okay, so basically, people got their jobs and became more and more ingrained into very, very specific things that they were doing, and with that came more and more alienation. Okay, so alienation is an important concept. It's the idea that you feel disconnected from society, from your own creativity, from your own freedom. Okay, so moving on. There's a few different bits to this, so sorry if it seems a bit disconnected. So Marx held the view that political power came with economic power, or came from economic power. Basically, the idea is if you have money, you can gain political power. Now, in modern society, I'm not sure I'm willing to disagree with that. I think that's largely true. But the power of the ruling class is rooted in its ownership and control of the means of production. We know that. Ruling class ideology seeks to justify ruling class domination through the ideas such as the free market, which distorts reality to create a positive image of capitalism as normal and natural. So, right, basically, we know most of that. Okay, now if you have political power, you can influence people. So, Boris Johnson, he says something, people will generally follow. If he creates a law, we have to follow it. Okay, so by having economic power, by having money, you can gain that political power. And what the bourgeoisie want to do, the ruling class, they don't want people to realize that actually they're being taken for a ride. Sort of these few people who own the machines and the fields and things like that, they're actually sort of making so much money out of the labor of the proletariat. That, I mean, any human would realize that that is entirely unreasonable. Is that's not a good situation. So why would you voluntarily do it? So what the ruling class do is they gain political power, and they basically make sure that even in like the education system, in the criminal justice system, that these ideas of sort of a free market where anyone can succeed. There's a meritocracy, happy days. Anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. They promote those ideas through the political spectrum, and basically make sure the proletariat never realize that actually they're being exploited. Okay, so this is actually what he calls false class consciousness, and I think that's what the next paragraph's talking about. So, to a Marxist, those members of the subject class, the proletariat, who accept this status quo, so what they mean by that, they accept the situation where they're being exploited, are victims of false class consciousness. Marx believed that class struggle was the driving force for social change. So basically, a revolution was the driving force for things to actually make a change. Furthermore, he believed that capitalist society, by its very nature, was unstable, as at its heart lay a basic conflict of interest between the workers whose labour is exploited and the capitalists who actually exploit their labour. So, what we were just saying, what reasonable human being would voluntarily get exploited so that someone else can just sit around and make tons of money? No one, no human being would allow that. Okay, so basically, he believed that eventually people would just start to realize this isn't fair, and they would have a revolution. Okay, so capitalism is unstable. Eventually, it would sort of boil up like a pot and explode. Okay, it would all go wrong for the bourgeoisie, and we'd have a revolution. So, Marx believed that as a consequence of the natural development of capitalism, the gap between the workers and the capitalist class would become greater and the differences more extreme. So, basically, all of this is happening. So, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and it's causing what he called polarization. Okay, they're becoming polar opposites, they're becoming more and more different. Okay, so basically, again, at this point, people would start to realize they're being exploited. Okay, even with the petty bourgeoisie, the small business owners, Marx thought that they would eventually end up being the proletariat. Okay, so everyone gets swallowed up by this polarization. Okay, and eventually there would be a revolution, a proletarian revolution, and an ideal communist society. Okay, so there's a bit of evaluation here. I'm not going to go through it too much because it's laid out fairly simply, but hopefully that's made you understand a little bit more about what Marx was talking about. It's a bit complex, but fingers crossed you've got it. Contact us if you would like to talk about it a bit more, and I'm sure we'd be more than happy to help. I'll see you in the next video where we talk about Max Weber. Thank you very much.